Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. So let's start maybe with a short explanation, justification on the title. Poacher 10 Gamekeeper Lessons Learned from 8 Years of Breaking Hypervisors. So the reason for choosing this title is that I've been interested in hypervisor security for a long time. So the first vulnerability I have found in virtualization software was in Microsoft Virtual Server, like in 2006, so a year ago. And then afterwards I found a couple others, and also I have contributed to projects like CubesOS and Bromium vCentry. For them, security of the underlying hypervisor is essential. So there's a chance I learned a couple of things in the process, and you're not wasting your time entirely. Okay, so agenda for today about the speaker we're done. We'll talk the types of hypervisors that you can encounter, and we'll try to evaluate the attack surface of the hypervisor, and then talk about various mitigation techniques against exploitation of vulnerabilities in the hypervisors. And not in order to not make it very dry, like technique 1, technique 2, I try to demonstrate it with hard cases of vulnerabilities, real-life vulnerabilities that would be prevented by employing a given technique. Yeah. Okay. So the types of the hypervisors, there are millions of them, millions of vendors, and this talk is mostly about the mainstream, popular commercial ones for x86 that can run Windows OS in a VM. That's because that's what I am mostly interested in, and I can talk about. Of course, there are others, like for embedded systems, there are academic ones, which are maybe even more interesting because sometimes the main goal is to achieve security. So particularly one way is to have the software to be formally verified. And particularly this last idea, maybe we all should be using only the formally verified software. It's a great idea, but as you probably know, formal software verification is insanely expensive, right? It's really very difficult to apply, and only a couple of projects actually use it. So for instance, SEL4 is the hypervisor that got verified, at least its core is verified on ARM platform, but as far as I know, it doesn't run Windows in a VM, so that's not very interesting for my purpose. Okay, and if we restrict ourselves to these commonly spotted hypervisors, we can group them in two categories, type 2 and type 1. So the first one, type 1, is here, right? And in this case, the hypervisor is a piece of code that's loaded by the bootloader, right? So it's the first real code. And then after it's done initializing, it starts one or more VMs, right? And in case of type 2, it's different. In this case, bootloader loads normal operating system like Windows or Linux. And then there's some driver loaded into the operating system that has the hypervisor functionality. And from this moment on, this hypervisor coexists with the operating system. So these two are quite different, but in fact, from the point of view of evaluating the attack surface, they're pretty much the same. So we can group them together. One important point is I will try to talk about DeepSafe later, the hypervisor from McAfee, and DeepSafe is totally different to these two. So for now on, let's just focus on this type 1, type 2. We'll cover DeepSafe later. Okay, so what's the attack surface? So this is a diagram that will stick here for a moment. So again, we assume that we use the virtualization supporting the Intel CPU or AMD. So we have hardware-assisted virtualization, and this supporting CPU creates, you can call it a jail, right? An environment that's restricted by the CPU. So the first assumption or requirement is that this supporting CPU that separates code running in VM mode is sound, right? That it cannot do anything unexpected to the rest of the system. And that assumption mostly holds. The design is extensive and sound, so we should not worry about that. Unfortunately, there is a couple of interesting CPU erratas that have some relevance. So there are some denial of service scenarios that are likely to be exploitable from within the VM jail. I haven't seen it in practice, but there is some potential. And even more worryingly, there are a couple of erratas that are really related to virtualization, and because of them, some state from VM leaks after VM exit, leaks to the host. I tried to exploit at least 2 of them. I failed. The reason is because mostly the conditions that trigger these vulnerabilities are very complex. They are not described extensively in the erratas, and still their impact would not be, that fatal, right? So again, my evaluation is that that's not what you should worry about, right? This isolation at the CPU level is really very good, and because it's very good, then a lot of people get the impression that the hypervisors are inherently secure, right? Because the CPU support is so good, there is good separation between VM and the rest of the system, so what could go wrong? The problem is that besides CPU, there is a lot of code that's needed for the whole virtualization system to run, right? So first of all, you have this hypervisor, or the core of the hypervisor, so the piece of code that actually handles VM exits and then relevant stuff. So again, this is software. It's written by humans. It might contain vulnerabilities, right? But again, the size of this component is not that much. And there are issues in that in the past, but again, not the worst problem you can encounter. The more worrying part is these remaining 2. Particularly, the device emulator is well known to have issues in the past. So again, it's needed because if you run normal operating system like Windows, for instance, it likes to think it talks to real hardware. So there is a device driver in the VM, and it likes to talk to something that looks like real hardware. So whenever it tries to do things like, for instance, write to I/O port, then hypervisor sees this request and informs the device emulator about it. And it's the device emulator job to actually perform the required action. Like, okay, if value Y was written to I/O port X, that it means that the device driver wants to send a packet through the network, so let's just emulate this action. So the problem is that this piece of code tends to be large, and there are vulnerabilities. And finally, the host services, the other stuff. So these 2 are enough to run, say, Windows OS, but many vendors try, to bundle as much functionality as possible in the product, right? To do some, nifty stuff to differentiate from the competition. And therefore, there are a lot of different services running in the privileged environment, like primary examples being, for instance, shared folders functionality. So if you want to make some fragment of the host file system be available to the guest, then you have this special service. That's, again, some pseudo driver in the guest is capable of talking to this service and get this extra functionality. And again, these tends to be large and have problems. And finally, in some scenarios, it is advantageous to give the VM the direct control over a hardware, like a PCI device. And then you have to be very careful when you do that, because if malicious code is able to program a PCI device, it can, do stuff. For instance, it can instruct the PCI device to do DMA access to the memory. So as a bare minimum, you have to use VTD, and VTD is a mechanism to restrict DMAs. And there are other considerations, so just to sum up, it's something you should be aware of. So to sum up, despite the support in CPU is very good, there is definitely attack surface for the commonly spotted hypervisors. So what's the conclusion? Should we just abandon all usage of hypervisor security, right? Because there is an attack surface. Again, depends what the goal is, right? If you do not plan to run some malicious code in the VMs, if you just want as much functionality as possible for your project, then you don't have to worry, right? But on the other hand, if the goal of using a hypervisor is to provide separation, right, security, really to jail malicious code in an environment it can escape, then you should be worrying, or you should at least consider, particularly if you are the developer of the virtualization system. Because then you should be aware that if you add any feature, you increase the attack surface, right? And it's a common trade-off. Okay, so let's compare it to something, right? Because I said there is an attack surface, so let's compare it to something else. For instance, if you look at the attack surface of common applications like browser, document editors, this one is totally hopeless. Like there are thousands of vulnerabilities in it. So the current trend is to wrap this large application into some sort of sandbox, usually implemented at the operating system level. For instance, Chrome browser is a well-known example of an application that wraps majority of its code within a sandbox. But then your problem is kernel attack surface, because all the sandboxes implemented at the level of operating system can be bypassed by using the kernel vulnerability. And it is a problem, at least on Windows. Again, I am mostly interested in Windows. There is a large attack surface against the kernel. So you have like 400 system calls, 800 Win32k system calls, and also you have stuff like IOCTLs that you can send instructions to the drivers or send the common escapes to the Windows display driver models. There was a nice presentation, I think yesterday, about the way how unprivileged code on Windows can provide some binary blobs to the display drivers, and they operate on it. That's apparently an attack surface. So the raw number is 76 CVEs allocated for Windows kernel mode vulnerabilities in 2013 alone, right? So this is much bigger attack surface, right? Again, it's not easy to really compare it in a sensible way, quantitatively, right? Because what we should compare is not the number of CVs allocated or stuff like that, but the real measurement is the complexity of the input, of the malicious input that a given solution should handle. And it's very difficult to even describe it, and not to mention not comparing it. For instance, people like to count the lines of the code in a given solution or size of the TCB. But again, I have a personal crusade into telling everyone it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense because there is no easy way to determine what percentage of the code base really is devoted to handling the untrusted input. So again, the raw number doesn't tell you much. But if you really need this number, so if you take for instance, Xen hypervisor, the latest version is about 1.7 million lines of code. But again, it's mostly bloat, and you can cut the fat, and you can strip it to about 110,000 lines of code in user mode and 60,000 lines of code in ring 0, still having very rich functionality. And Windows 7 kernel is supposedly around 2 million lines of code. Likely Win32k is larger. So again, if you compare the lines of code, then you see that the hypervisor is smaller. But again, really, you have to rely on experience to compare these things. And I think that the opinion of the majority is that the attack surface of a well-written hypervisor is smaller than a normal operating system. There is, for instance, interesting project from Microsoft Research named Drawbridge, in which they run large applications like Microsoft Office directly on top of the hypervisor, like totally bypassing the kernel. Again, the reason for doing that is in that solution, the interface between the privileged code, so the hypervisor, and the application is much thinner. So again, it's another argument that attack surface of the hypervisor is thinner. So that's subjective opinions, but there are a couple of hard facts, really that's defendable facts. For instance, that the VM exit boundary, so boundary between the VM and the hypervisor, is much stronger than the boundary enforced by the syscall, so between the kernel and the user mode. And it really makes the real exploitation much more difficult. So let's have a couple of examples about exploitability of memory corruption bugs. So in case of browser vulnerabilities, it's hopeless again. The attacker has a lot of control over, for instance, the layout of memory. It can do things like heap tray or just aligning the objects at the proper places, and we'll see an example later. So that's exploitation is very efficient. In case when you try to attack a sandbox and you try to attack a broker, so on Windows, all the processes have the same library basis, right? So when you are in the sandbox, you already know the position of the libraries in the broker. So you don't have ASLR, essentially. So that's bad. And in case of kernel exploits, again, the address space in user mode and in kernel mode is the same, right? So it means that if an attacker can craft or prepare some useful data structures in user mode, in memory that he controls, and if it can force the kernel to interpret it as a trusted kernel data structures, then essentially it's game over. So the best example is exploitation of null pointer dereferences. That's the root of the problem, that the address space, the virtual memory mapping is the same in the user mode and in the kernel. SMAP is supposed to help with that. It's a future feature of the CPU, of Intel CPUs, but you won't have support for that in Windows anytime soon. And finally, Windows kernel essentially hands out its memory layout for free to the attacker. There is an API that you can say, what's the base of the kernel, right? So it's really ridiculous. It's better on Windows 8.1, but it's not fixed entirely. And all of these issues do not exist when you consider attacking a hypervisor, right? So if you think about exploiting memory corruption issue against a hypervisor, you need infoleak to get some information about memory layout and then write primitive, the memory corruption. There are exceptions to that. You probably remember Cloudburst. It was VM escape from VMware presented at Black Hat in 2009, I guess, by Immunity guys. And it was a real case of very reliable VM escape exploit based on memory corruption. The reason for that was that the underlying vulnerability was so powerful that you could get full read-write access to the whole memory of VMware VMX process, right? So then exploitation is easy. But again, it's rather an exception, not a rule. The other exploits that I have seen mostly rely on ASLR being not implemented properly, like, you know, the binary was not compiled with the proper flags and it's not position independent, or there were DLLs that have a fixed base. So again, to sum up, real exploits against hypervisor vulnerabilities are much more difficult in comparison to other scenarios. Okay, so finally, virtualization is nice because it's mostly transparent, right? So you don't have to choose between sandbox based on the operating system and the virtualization. You can stack one upon another, right? So in order for that to work, there are a couple of assumptions. So first of all, you have to assume that the hypervisor can be attacked only after the attacker gets the code execution in the VM kernel, right? And that holds most of the time. Unfortunately, there are some products that expose some services in the hypervisor even to the user mode of the VM. That's bad. Again, you have to assume that there is nothing valuable in a VM, because if attacker gets everything he wants after compromising the VM, like, for instance, access to your internal network, then why should he bother to break out of VM? And finally, you have to assume that the code that comes with the hypervisor, like the guest additions, guest drivers, do not weaken the security of the VM kernel. But if that holds, and these are more or less reasonable assumptions, then you have pure gain. You can, this is a diagram of Chrome sandbox. You can have, you know, all the best operating system-based sandbox, and again, wrap it within the VM, right? And with that approach, you combine the strengths of both approaches. So that's really advantageous thing. Okay, so to sum up this section, in my opinion, the virtualization, isolation by virtualization really improves security, despite the known weaknesses and possible problems with hypervisors, even with off-the-shelf products. Again, mostly because you can just stack it upon everything else OS-based. Again, in order to maximize security, hypervisor should be small. If it's bloated, it has a large attack surface, you have a problem. Fortunately, sometimes, or maybe often, the good design can provide good functionality, not sacrificing security. And we'll see examples in a way. Okay, so now a couple of case studies. We'll start with 4 vulnerabilities in VirtualBox hypervisor that I have found reported to the Oracle in March this year, and they fixed it pretty quickly. So that's good for them. And 3 out of 4 are related to shared folders functionality. So you remember that shared folders is this extra service, right? So you have a VM, and it's allowed to talk over some IPC channel to a process on the host. In case of VirtualBox, it's named VBox SDL. And VM is allowed to request things like, please read a file for me, right? So in the virtual machine configuration, you specify the root to the shared folder, and VM is supposed to be able to access files under this root, right? That's the idea. So again, the problem with VirtualBox shared folders code on the host is that it's large. So for instance, it supports both UTF-8 and Unicode path names. And the host code is supposed, to convert between them two. So that's a non-trivial piece of code. And also probably because of that, it does not check whether the incoming path names from the VM are properly null terminated, right? Because deep in the stack, if you don't know if the path name is UTF-8 or Unicode, you don't have an easy way to check for null termination. It must do casing corrections. So for instance, if the VM runs Windows, who doesn't care about the difference in casing in path names, and the host runs Linux, then you have to do extra corrections for that to work. And the most bizarre part is that the guest can specify the path delimiter. So the guest can say, slash is not a path delimiter, some weird character is a path delimiter. And host is supposed to normalize the incoming path, changing each occurrence of this guest specified path delimiter to slash. So it's really too much. And the consequences are, you can say, expected. So the first issue is memory corruption in the function that builds the full path. And it's related to the support of custom path delimiter. So what this function does is just overrides each occurrence of this guest specified path delimiter with this constant, which is slash. And it does it until it sees the terminating null. But again, unfortunately, because there is no check in the code for null termination, it means it can write after the end of the buffer, right? So it's essentially memory corruption. How to exploit it to get code execution, I don't have a good idea by now. The reason is that attacker has very limited control of this corruption, right? It can only corrupt the bytes between the null terminator on only a single one. But again, in comparison, if such a vulnerability was found in browser code, the exploitation would be more or less straightforward or typical, right? So what you would do is to arrange the memory layout that after our buffer with the path name, there would be an array object. And one of the fields in an array object is a size. So what you would use this memory corruption for is to change the size of the array object. And then after that, it's more or less game over. So again, it shows that real exploitation is much more difficult in real life. Okay, and the lesson is the host service code really should accept only very narrow input. And in this case, it's totally doable because both sides of the pipe are VirtualBox code. So all the conversions, normalizations should be done in the guest, not on the host. The next issue is the directory traversal. And again, in all the code that provides shared folders-like functionality, you have to be worried about directory traversal because, for instance, what happens if the guest sends the path name that has double dots in it, right? If you just concatenate it to the shared folders root, you would get immediate directory traversal. So it means that the hypervisor code has to somehow sanitize the incoming path. And how it's done in case of VirtualBox, a little bit, it's too complicated. So essentially, you break the incoming path from the guest into the components by splitting it at the slash or backslash, and you count the numbers of normal path components, like their name, and the double dot components. And you count how many normal components, how many double dot components. And if there is less double dot components than normal ones, then you accept. If not, then you deny. So this path, their name, double dot dot is okay because you have one double dot component and one normal component and the other is not. because you have too many double dot components. So again, it looks a little bit too complicated. And of course, it has a fatal flaw, particularly on POSIX hosts like Linux, and I think on Solaris as well, there is support for Solaris. Backslash is not a path separator. So you can have a path component that has backslashes in it, but it's a single path component. So exploitation is simple. So you create a directory in the shared folder with a name like that. It has a lot of backslashes. And then you access by giving a path name that consists of the single component and a lot of double dots. So again, VirtualBox will think that this path is correct because it will think that, okay, you have like 8 normal path components, but in reality it's only 1. And this first double dot will result in directory traversal, and then these additional double dots will take you up to the real file system root. And then you can access arbitrary file on the host. Again, it happens only when the host runs Linux or other POSIX system on Windows, it's okay. So the lesson is roughly the same as the previous one. All this sanitization code should be really simple, so it's enough to refuse all the double dots. It's okay. And there are OS support, like on Linux you can use chroot, on Windows you can prefix the path names with this question mark, and that turns off like interpretation of double dots. And generally beware when your code is supposed to be portable and run on multiple platforms, right? There are problems with that. Okay, the third issue is data leak in shared folders code. It's not very interesting. You can have a look at the white paper. By the way, on the CDs, there's a very preliminary version of the slides and no white paper, so just have a look at the Black Hat site. It will be published later. So again, there is a data leak. Let's skip the details for now. And the fourth one is most hilarious one. It's not something that can be exploited by the VM. It's a privilege escalation of the host. So using this vulnerability, an unprivileged process running on the host can escalate to kernel. And the problem is, okay, so VirtualBox has both kernel mode components. There is this vmmr0.sys driver and user mode components. And both of them need access to the crucial data structure named struct_vm. So the good guys at Oracle, or even previously, have figured out that the solution for this is to map both these data structure to the same physical memory, right? So it's good, it works, but effect is that, again, the user mode process can alter the memory that later is used by the kernel. And it happens that this structure is totally trusted by the kernel. For instance, it contains function pointers, which are later dereferenced by the kernel. So again, if you can modify a function pointer in the kernel, that's escalation to the kernel mode execution is trivial. There is a lesson for that. I will let you draw conclusions by yourself. Okay, so these were the new vulnerabilities found by me. So a couple of more examples from the past. So this CVE from 2007 is also, the lesson for that is that you should offload to VM as much as possible. So the problem was that there was a component of Xen named pygrab, which used to parse some data structure which is influenceable by the guest. It happens to be the file system. And it used to run in the privileged domain. So it means that any problem with that is fatal. And the solution is to use a different program named pvgrab that does exactly the same, but it runs entirely in the VM. So if it runs in a VM, if it's compromised, then you don't lose much. So again, this is a very powerful technique. If you can offload anything you can to the VM. Another example, use after free vulnerability in QEMU KVM. There was a talk at Black Hat 2011 about that. And this time, the problem is in device emulation. So you could trigger this vulnerability by writing to emulated chipset registers. And that would trigger the action usually taken in case of PCI hot plugging, but in this case, you try to hot plug the device that was not actually hot plugged in. And that results in use after free scenario. So again, it shows that device emulators are a problem. And we should think whether we can come up with any generic mitigations. For instance, for this particular problem, can we just deny all the access to the PCI config access space for the VM? Right? It would be nice to entirely close this attack vector. And of course, the answer is no. You cannot deny this access because the VM won't boot. Right? Operating system needs access to PCI config space in order to configure the virtual hardware. Okay, that's true, but again, note the statement that in order to boot, right? So what you can do is use a technique named delusional boot, and with that, you grant certain functionality only during the boot time. So what you do, you start a VM with all this PCI config access space granted, let it boot, that's when this functionality is used. Then, for instance, you can save the VM, change the config of the VM, and this time deny this access. And the crucial part is that in this preliminary phase, you do not expose it to malicious input, right? So you do not open browser in this VM. Just the preparatory phase, just let it boot. So then, after you change the config, you can restore the VM with a more restricted config right now, and then you expose it to the malicious input. And again, the gain is that some piece of functionality has been removed, again with no bad effects. So again, it's pretty useful. Another one, heap-based buffer overflow in the code responsible for emulation of the network card, E1000 in QEMU. Again, it shows that the device emulation is a problem. So again, do we have some generic method to cope with that? And there is one, at least for instance, in case of Xen, you can define so-called stub domains. And stub domain is a dedicated VM, which is not a general purpose VM. Its sole purpose is to hold the code of the device emulator. So what happens is, even if there is a vulnerability in the device emulator, even if the VM is capable of exploiting that, all it gains is code execution in another VM. Again, this VM is not privileged, it's just a container. In order to provide some service, this stub domain must be capable of accessing some resources from the host. So for instance, if you think again about emulating a network card, this device emulator should be capable of actually sending and receiving packets. So it must be granted some access to the actual network which is available on the host, and that's why you have this communication channel to some PV driver running on the host, so in the privileged environment. But again, the benefit is, the gain is that this communication line is much thinner than the original to the device emulator. So the probability of exploiting this component is much smaller, which is good. And in fact, if you think about it, you need this scenario, so you need a dedicated device emulator only if the VM is vanilla ones, to put it this way. If you just if you need to run unmodified Windows that loads, E1000 driver from Intel and thinks it can use it. If the VM knows it runs under a hypervisor, for instance, you install proper drivers in that, you don't need this device emulation code layer at all. You can just let the VM talk directly to the PV driver that will do the necessary action. So again, what you need to do is to install the PV drivers in the VM that do not think it can talk to the real hardware. It knows it must use the proper interface to talk to the host. And again, this communication channel is much thinner. So that's really commendable to use that kind of approach. Another one. This time it's vulnerability in IGMP handling of Windows kernel that resulted in remote code execution in Windows kernel context. So quite a bad one. If you're not totally asleep yet, you realize it's a vulnerability in Windows, not in the virtualization. So what was the purpose of talking about it? The reason is that you can use the functionality of the hypervisor to mitigate that kind of vulnerabilities. So what you can do is again have a special VM, special purpose VM, you can name it service VM, and move some of the privileged code, like the drivers for the network card, particularly wireless cards, right? Parts of the networking stack, things like DHCP client, and you move it all into this dedicated VM. And in order for this to work, this dedicated VM should have access to the actual network card. So if you go back here, it's the same scenario, but in this case, you don't have this communication channel. It's not needed because this VM can talk to the actual hardware directly. So it does not need any service from the host in order to send the network packets. It can instruct the real hardware to do that. And again, the benefit is that this time in this VM, you have a lot of code that normally runs off the host. Like again, networking stack, drivers for the wireless card. So this time, we are not defending against the rogue VM. We are defending again the attacks that can come over the network. You can think about it that you have an extra firewall in front of your operating system, right? Except this firewall is implemented as a VM. And again, it's a very interesting approach. You don't have to worry, about like vulnerabilities in your wireless card drivers when you come to some host-side environment. And some solutions like Cubes or Xen Client XT install the network VM by default, right? Again, it's very useful. And finally, all these previous techniques are actually used. So you can find software that actually makes use of all of this. And this one is more for the future. So the idea is to make the whole type 2 host a giant service VM, right? So normally the host is a privileged piece of code, and for instance, it can do whatever it wants with a VM. And in this technique, you kind of revert it. So the only privileged code is the hypervisor, and the host cannot, for instance, read the memory of the VM. And then you can run all the device emulators, etc., in the host, because at this moment the compromise of the host is not fatal, it's not terminal. If you have some secrets that are stored in the VM, compromised host cannot get these secrets. And it's very useful in some scenarios. So again, in order for this to work, you have to have a reliable protection of VMs against the compromised host, right? And it's tricky, especially if you consider how device model works, because device model usually needs to access the memory of VM, but it's doable with some careful planning. So that's, again, it's a little bit complicated, difficult to explain in one slide. You can have a look at this reference to see more how it's supposed to work. Just be aware that there are quite some issues with that. So particularly in this scenario, the host still has full access to the hardware, right? So you have to protect the hypervisor against hardware-based attacks. And there are other issues like who controls the input devices, like who controls the keyboard. If we don't want, for instance, the compromised host to be able to snoop the keyboard. Have a look at the passwords. But again, it's for the future. Okay, and finally, my favorite part, so about DeepSafe. So DeepSafe is interesting. Again, it's a hypervisor written by McAfee, and it's interesting because it's not a general purpose hypervisor. It's something very dedicated, intended to improve the security. So again, hypervisor security, like my favorite pick. So how it works? So you install DeepSafe. If you install it, it just installs some boot time driver. And very early, during the boot of the Windows operating system, it gets control and it installs itself as a hypervisor. And what VM is run? It wraps all the Windows operating system in a VM. If you remember the project Bluepill by Joanna Rutkowska from 2006, that's exactly how Bluepill worked, except Bluepill was malicious code, which tried to install itself as the hypervisor and wrap all the existing operating system in a VM. And McAfee DeepSafe does exactly the same thing, but for good, right? So it deprivileges the whole operating system into a VM. And once deep safe driver start, it's the only piece of code that is actually the most privileged, right? The whole operating system is wrapped in a VM, and it's under the control of the deep safe hypervisor. So the obvious question is, why take this effort, right? What's the reason for that? And the answer is in order to have some defense against kernel rootkits. So nowadays, if you have a vulnerability that results in an attacker getting control over the kernel of your operating system, it's game over, right? Because no matter what security software you run, it can be disabled by the malicious code running at the level of the kernel, because kernel is the most privileged part. And with this design, kernel is no longer the most privileged code, right? It's still under the control of the hypervisor. So this hypervisor still is intact, it should stay intact, even if the whole operating system is compromised, and it can still try to detect some malicious activity, right? And the main purpose of DeepSafe is to detect the activities commonly exhibited by rootkits. Like, for instance, if they try to hook the body of the kernel in order to install a rootkit. So that's nice. In order for this to work, it's obvious that this DeepSafe hypervisor must protect itself against the VM, right? Just like any other hypervisor. So for instance, when CPU runs the DeepSafe VM, which is the operating system, there is extended page table protection in place. So DeepSafe configures EPT in a way that CPU, when running in a VM mode, cannot access the body of the hypervisor. That's good. That's how it's supposed to work. But how about memory accesses done by PCI devices? Right? In this scenario, you don't have any device emulation, right? You don't have any service VM. All the devices of the PCI devices are still commanded by this operating system. Although it's still a VM, but still it has access to all the PCI devices. And it's worrying because, again, the PCI devices, which are busmaster capable, can, again, access any memory of the system. And by default, it can access all the memory of the system, with some irrelevant exceptions. And the solution to this problem is VTD. VTD is a functionality implemented in the chipset. And if you configure the VTD register properly, you can restrict what memory ranges can be accessed by the PCI device, right? So the obvious use for this is to tell VTD that any PCI device cannot touch the body of the hypervisor. Okay, it means that in order to be secure and reliable, DeepSafe must use VTD to protect itself against DMA attacks, right? And again, the problem is it does not do it. And frankly, what I said in previous 5 minutes is not something very new or like black magic, right? The existence of VTD is obvious to anyone who is interested in Intel chipset capabilities. In Black Hat 2008, so again, a long time ago, I showed DMA attacks against Xen hypervisor. So again, something old. Joanna Rutkowska has written a well-known blog about the necessity of VTD in order to protect DeepSafe. So again, it was like in 2012, so again, a long time ago. Still, they chose not to use this functionality. And again, the impact is severe because it's total impact of the DeepSafe hypervisor integrity. In runtime, you can just override the body of the hypervisor. So it's really bad. One reason why they elected not to do it, my anticipated reason, is that they thought it's totally infeasible to do it in practice, right? And indeed, if you think that in order to force a device to do arbitrary DMA, you would think you need to just program its registers, right? So you would need to have the same amount of code that device drivers do. However, it's not the case. The trick here is that you can use the existing drivers in the operating system for that. Particularly, the easiest way to do it is with the disk driver, with the disk controller. So how you do it? First of all, you have to have kernel privileges, right? Then the algorithm is you allocate a page at some virtual address V, And then you change the page table entry of V so that it points to physical address P. So this step is crucial because by messing with the page tables, you fool the Windows operating system, you lie to it what's the actual physical address associated with this virtual address V. And then you call the Windows API create file and pass the file flag no buffering. And if Windows sees this flag, it knows it's supposed to do DMA to the user buffer. No buffering, no buffer cache. Whenever it's possible, it does DMA. And then you do read file, write file normally, passing V as the buffer. And because we lied to Windows what's the actual physical location of this buffer, it will do DMA to address P, to arbitrary address P. Again, implementation of that is like 100 lines of C code, so nothing horrible. One catch: it does not work with file system that's protected by the BitLocker, because if it is BitLocker, then you cannot actually do straight DMA from the BitLocker volume to the user buffer because it's encrypted, right? So that won't work. So in this case, you can use the boot partition because boot partition cannot be encrypted, so you can use DMA from that. Okay, that's nice. So what we can do with that capability? So if we control the hypervisor, we could just disable that. That's possible in theory, but that's too much work. And frankly, why would an attacker want to disable DeepSafe in that moment? So think about it. You have a piece of code that's well separated from the rest operating system, from all the security software that runs in this operating system. It's protected from that, and it has full control of this operating system, right? So it's a perfect place to place rootkit functionality in it, right? Highly privileged and secure from the rest of the code. So for the demonstration purposes, I have implemented the rootkit that hides the changes to one particular model-specific register, L-star. Why this particular register? Because it's a crucial one that tells Windows operating system where is the system call handler, right? So if you change this register on CPU, you have full control how syscalls are dispatched on Windows. Essentially, you have full control over the user mode. So that's very powerful. And DeepSafe actually has a detection that triggers whenever this MSR is written in the operating system. Again, whenever this MSR is written, there's a VM exit, and DeepSafe checks. Okay, that's a VM exit for the reason write to MSR. Oh, that's bad. Let's raise an alert. And similarly, on 64-bit version of Windows, there's PatchGuard that checks for that. So it periodically runs a thread that checks, has the value of this MSR changed? If so, backcheck the host, because we are under attack. So what I did is write a piece of code that blinds both. So first of all, I modify the VM exit handler in DeepSafe, so it would no longer alert when it sees such a VM exit, raised because of changing of this model-specific register. And furthermore, whenever PatchGuard tries to read this MSR register, DeepSafe will lie to it. It will say, okay, it has not changed, everything is fine, it's not the droids you're looking for. So with that approach, you blind both solutions, both the detection at the hypervisor level and both the detection at the operating system level. So it's pretty ironic. And that's kind of demo, right? I don't have a good idea how I should demonstrate that stuff. It simply run some code, it produces some output saying it works, right? And the only visible thing is that PatchGuard does not panic the box, right? So that's the best I can come up with. And it really works. I tested it on a couple of boxes. It's pretty good. Okay, just to let you know, there are other concerns about how DeepSafe works. Again, the main problem with DeepSafe is that its purpose is not to isolate malicious code, right? Previously, we said that hypervisors are good at isolating malicious code in the VM, and we don't care what happens in the VM. Even if it's compromised, it's isolated, so it cannot affect us, right? And DeepSafe does something different. It tries to detect, right? It uses the capability of the hypervisor to actually look into VM and see if there's anything wrong going with that. And that's much more difficult approach. Simply, it's not obvious how to detect that something wrong is going on in the VM, right? It's not easy to detect a rootkit. Of course, if the rootkit behaves in a very unusual way that's easily detectable, right? Again, it tries to override the kernel body, it's easy. But for instance, there is some functionality exposed or offered by the Windows operating system, like filter drivers, that can be used to implement a very effective rootkit, and it won't trigger any alerts by DeepSafe, because this same functionality is used by legal software, commonly by antivirus software. So it's very difficult to distinguish between actions done by AV and a rootkit, right? And there are other issues. Again, all these problems are mostly because of the fact that DeepSafe tries to detect that something wrong is happening in a VM. So it's not just isolating and forgetting about it, but trying to detect. So that's a problem. Okay, I guess that's pretty much it. Just a quick summary. So just things to remember. So hypervisors have non-negligible attack surface. That's simply the truth, right? Still, despite them being not non-perfect, they are useful if you use them to protect even less secure operating system, right? The problem is that Windows operating system is even less secure, right? So by wrapping it within the hypervisor, you gain some security. And then it's best to use well-written hypervisor. And there are some generic methods to actually reduce attack surface exposed by a hypervisor. And if you use these methods, your hypervisor is much hardened, much more secure. Yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all I have. Some questions? Yeah, go ahead to the mic. Use the mic.
The question I have is, you talked about IMMU to some degree. What impact would enabling an IMMU in terms of security from your perspective related to hypervisors?
But say it again.
So an IOMMU, like the VTD or AMD's IOMMU, enabling that hardware support, you said some do and some don't enable. If you enabled it, what impact do you believe that would have on some of these vulnerabilities or security related to hypervisors?
Yeah, so if you enable VTD, if you enable IOMMU, you can't do any malicious DMA. So for instance, if DeepSafe enabled VTD, it would be much more secure because you couldn't use DMA to overwrite its body. And they really should they really should use it. It's mandatory. And again, it's a solution almost exclusively for the purpose of that, for the purpose of protecting the hypervisor. That's why it exists. Anything else? No? Oh, okay, go on to the mic.
How is Bromium protected against SMM or BIOS-based attacks?
I would not like to talk about vendor-specific things. I would just say it's not a concern entirely, right? And we can talk about it later. I don't like it to turn into a vendor pitch, okay? But answer is it's not relevant totally, and we can talk about it later if you wish.
Okay.
That's all. Okay. Thank you.